issue, which I think will change the mood.
Could a moment more perfectly encapsulate the root of one of hockey's most prevailing and enduring conspiracies? Watching a Canadian team come within the brink of a historic overturning of a 3-0 Stanley Cup Final Series deficit against a Sunbelt expansion team no less, and then falling short with the greatest Canadian player since Gretzky on its roster. Even as journalists began erasing their Edmonton come all the way back headlines, even before Sasha Barkov lifted Lord Stanley's Cup, Canadian hockey fans were flooding the various channels of social media with the now familiar refrain. Once more, the NHL commissioner had ensured the continued dominance of American teams in the Canadian game. Once again, Gary Bettman had engineered an American victor. I'm sure many speak in jest. It's a meme now, part of hockey's zeitgeist, Gary Bettman, the pantomime villain. But there are those who genuinely believe Gary Bettman has puppet mastered every single Stanley Cup since he assumed the office of commissioner in February 1993. Contrary to popular belief, he assumed the office before the Montreal Canadiens lifted the cup in June of 1993, somewhat undermining the notion from the outset. But subscribers to the belief will point out that Bettman was acting alongside the final incumbent president, Gil Stein, until the July after Montreal won their 25th and up to now last Stanley Cup. In fact, that was it for Canadian teams. I started following hockey in 1994, aged 9. I have never seen a Canadian team lift the cup. I have seen 30 Stanley Cup finals, 60 opportunities to play for a cup. In my time following hockey, there have been at one time 8 Canadian teams in a 26-team league. I have seen Winnipeg relocated to Phoenix in the much reviled Sunbelt expansion that had begun prior to Bettman's appointment. However, as proponents to the conspiracy will posit, his principal remit was to continue to expand the game in America. Some would add to the detriment of Canada. In my time, I have seen Quebec relocated to Denver. I saw the league expand to places like Nashville, Atlanta, and Las Vegas. I saw NHL hockey return to Winnipeg. At any one time, Canadian teams have made up between 31 to 20% of the makeup of the league. So by now, Canadian teams should have statistically won at least 5 or 6 cups during Bettman's reign. And further, Canadian teams should have comprised between 12 and 20 of all finalists in that 30-year period. Yet no Canadian team has lifted the cup in this time, and only 7 have made it to the finals, and that includes the Montreal Canadiens in the somewhat bizarre COVID era. A coincidence? You decide. Indeed, many have. Gary Bettman hates Canada has become the mantra. The Ottawa Senators were a team on the cusp of greatness in 2004, despite underachieving as cup favourites in 2003-04, and a change of coach with Jacques Martin being binned off for Brian Murray. This was the Senators of Jason Spezza, Zdeno Chara, Dominik Hasek, Marian Hossa, Daniel Alfredsson, Wade Redden. And the signing of Dominik Hasek made them hot favourites heading into 2004-2005. And then, what do you know? Gary Bettman goes on and spoils it all by locking the league out for an entire season. Now, this Senators core lost a year, but were largely the same team minus Hossa, who'd been swapped out for Danny Heatley, creating the cash line, while a few depth players like a past his prime Radek Bonk had left. The lockout didn't do too much harm to the Sens, who would go on to finish top of the Eastern Conference and then choke in the second round. Sens law / headcanon aside, owners were spending 76% of all revenue on player salaries prior to the lockout. Bettman was alongside the owners he represented, looking for cost certainty to avoid running teams into the ground. For fan bases of cash-rich teams such as Toronto, this was characterized as trying to save financially unviable Sunbelt franchises. Truth was, the reason we have a league with such parity today is because Bettman brought the NHLPA to heel over the salary cap and stopped cash-rich teams like the Rangers paying 5-year, $45 million contracts to players like Bobby Holik, only to buy them out when those contracts didn't work, with no repercussions. Believe it or not, there were smaller Canadian markets that actually benefited from the lockout and subsequent financial restructuring of the league. And reasonably historic American markets outside the Sunbelt like Pittsburgh and Washington were on the brink of bankruptcy prior to the lockout.
We are committed to having 6 healthy, vibrant teams in Canada, and we're going to do everything possible to ensure that that's the reality. This is not the first time that we've dealt with a franchise in such a situation. We've had a number of these, including Pittsburgh fairly recently, and we've managed to work our way through it. This is the beginning of a process to deal with the problems the Senators have. We as a league have an economic system that needs to be fixed. It's something that we're committed to doing. I've repeatedly said that if we don't resolve our problems quickly, they will only get worse, and that some teams will struggle to get to the opportunity in 2004 to fix our economic system.
Bettman is often characterized as the villain of every piece, but a commissioner is simply a figurehead for the team's owners, the NHL Board of Governors. Bettman negotiates on behalf of the owners and the interests of the league as a financial institution. This includes the Canadian team owners. Bettman is really just an avatar for the owners. To say Gary Bettman hates Canada would also mean the Canadian team owners also hate Canada. I'm sure the MLSE would love unfettered spending, but they'd not done a fat lot with it in the nearly 40 years prior to the lockout. Quebec City doesn't have a franchise, not because Gary Bettman doesn't want them to, although I'm sure he would prefer a larger US TV market with greater revenue potential. But you better believe Jeff Molson also has his ear. With all that said, Bettman does love to put his foot in it. Reading the riot act in Winnipeg last season regarding attendance was a tad tone deaf, considering the Coyotes were playing out of an arena that wouldn't even be the biggest in the British Elite League. But hey, he sorted that out by moving them to Salt Lake City. Oofed. But Ryan Smith had an arena ready, sort of, and the fact of the matter was there was disconnect between Jets fans and their ownership, and that needed addressing. So maybe Gary showing up like the Grim Reaper is one way to resolve the issues in Winnipeg? But Richard, you say, 30 years, 0 cups, 1 Bettman. If it's not Bettman, why can't Canadian teams win a cup? On the 26th of November 2020, Brian Burke appeared on the Spitting Chicklets podcast and divested some interesting information regarding no trade clauses, going as far to suggest many players with NTCs and those who waive their NMCs will often cite one or all of the Canadian franchises as no-goes. Burke went as far as to dub it a No Canada clause.
You ask for eight teams on the no trade list. You give a no-fly zone 8 teams. All 7 Canadian teams are almost always on it. It's for tax reasons. But even your Canadian players give you a list with all the Canadian teams on it. Breaks my heart.
To extrapolate on why players clause out Canada is to basically encapsulate the entire video, but the bigger problem for Canadian teams is that over 200 NHL players sport NTCs and NMCs in their contracts. By comparison, only a handful of NBA players have ever received an NTC, and while NBA players can veto trades in some circumstances, it is considerably rarer in the cash-rich NBA than the NHL, where players generally earn less than their pro sports compatriots, and have to be lured into contracts offering greater stability in their personal lives. NTCs have existed in the NHL since the 70s, but have proliferated post-salary cap as NHL players' relative earning potential decreased against revenue. So when you are earning less than other pro athletes, are you going to want to be taxed more? Because playing in Montreal, Toronto and Ottawa will see you suffering 3 of the top 10 tax rates in the league, but without the benefit of the Californian sun. And that Californian sun I mentioned, or the Floridian one with the lowest effective tax rate? Canadian cities are viewed as cold and boring compared to many of the southern franchises, although Utah may take that biscuit next year. While Canadian cities are generally safer, a pool for players with young families, and the largest proportion of NHL players still call Canada home, another pool, you also have to deal with the intense media microscope that comes with playing in the highly scrutinized Canadian markets. The kind of scrutiny a player traveling to his practice facility in a Floridian golf cart or walking the streets of San Jose will not be subject to. Now, don't get me wrong, heavily scrutinized American franchises have succeeded during the reign of Bettman, and playing in New York or Detroit or Chicago comes pretty close to the same prestige as playing in Canada. All this means that Canadian teams are often dumpster diving at trade deadline or overpaying for free agents due to media expectations and tax coverage, or they're simply picking up the stragglers. Remember Toronto paying Jeff Finger $3.5 million for 4 years? Prestige alone is not enough to attract the best talent north of the border, and this is even more keenly felt with European players. Players' partners are less likely to want to decamp to Winnipeg from New York or Los Angeles. Now we play in an era of cost certainty. And I suppose in that respect you could blame Gary Bettman. But as much as Bettman wants more American eyes on the sport, he is not actively trying to alienate the sport's most fervent fanbase. Because ultimately, Gary Bettman is a businessman, and losing Canadian fans would be bad for business, and that's Bettman's principal motivation for anything he does. He is not operating in the shadows, actively hobbling Canadian teams, and while the salary cap hasn't helped the Canadian megaliths hoard talent, it's also helped smaller Canadian markets remain competitive. Canadian teams have now played in 5 Stanley Cup Final Game 7s. 5 times a Canadian team has been within a game of lifting the cup since Bettman came to power. Some were heavily favoured, such as the 2011 Vancouver Canucks. Some made it there as total outsiders, like the 8th-seeded 2006 Edmonton Oilers, making it to 7 games despite losing their starting goalie Dwayne Rollerson in Game 1 and coughing up a huge lead as a result. Short of Gary Bettman walking onto the ice and doing a Tonya Harding to Dwayne Rollerson, it's hard not to see Canadian teams coughing up 5 Game 7s as being a byproduct of the pressure of being a Canadian team trying to break a hoodoo like Jeff Skinner. Not the machinations of Gary Bettman.
Do you want to live in Edmonton at the end of this deal for 15, 20 years? Mm-hmm. Or do you not? And it's not that Edmonton is a bad place to live. Far from it. There's over 1 million people there. They all seem to like it. But the reality of the situation is, in the NHL, there are markets that are hot markets for free agency. Mm-hmm. Edmonton was this year because they went to the finals.
Yeah.
But Edmonton has had a devil of a time trying to sign free agents in the past. And so, this is going to come down to, do you want to live in Edmonton or not? Do you want to be an Oiler or not?
As always, I'm sure this will be seen as a spicy take by some, but hey, if you enjoy spicy deconstructions of hockey conspiracies, please like and subscribe, ring the bell, share the video, and sacrifice a goat like Gary Bettman does every time a Canadian team threatens to win the cup. You know, the usual. Much to my chagrin, you can now find me on Twitter and Instagram, and it would be lovely to be followed by some people that weren't lusty bots. And until next time.